for 38 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll assess the military situation. I am Julian Repke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we start in the southeast of Ukraine, in the Donetsk region. There, new Russian videos, or rather, videos of Russian attacks clearly show that the shortage of tanks and armored vehicles is becoming more and more glaring within the Russian army. We have numerous new attacks every day. However, we see fewer and fewer classic military vehicles, and instead more and more junk vehicles, namely Lada vehicles, off-road vehicles, motorcycles and such that the Russians use. And we want to take a look at the videos that provide clear evidence of this particular situation. We'll begin with Uspenivka, a small village located just a short distance away from the nearby town of Pokrovsk in this region. And now we can already see on the horizon how the Russians are trying to push forward here. This entire scene was captured by a drone from the Ukrainian army, which is closely tracking this vehicle here. And we can see this is a vehicle fully occupied with Russian soldiers. At least 5 soldiers are in there and on top. And we can see the Russians have absolutely no chance to defend themselves because this is a direct attack on a Ukrainian position. We'll pause it here for a moment, and we can clearly see where infantry fighting vehicles once operated, where there was once the opportunity to protect oneself with armor against these types of drone attacks. There, we can clearly see at least 2 people sitting inside at the front. 3 infantrymen are currently looking back, while one, acting as a replacement for the gun on the BMP or the BTR, is aiming his rifle forward. Now we see the drone's impact pixelated by us. So we can assume that this strike here has likely caused severe injuries or, yes, even the death of the Russian soldiers. Now we can clearly see more drones approaching the area. Incredibly, it's Russian army motorcycles that are carrying out these attacks right here. 2 soldiers are on each motorcycle. We're pixelating the entire scene because the first drone, or perhaps the same one, has effectively halted the soldiers' progress, that they essentially panic, cause the accident, and afterward, the drone had a relatively easy task of targeting and hitting these soldiers on the ground, presumably killing them. We now see here the fire that was just started by the first drone, and right behind it, you can already spot it, the next Russian motorcycle heading in the same direction and now being pursued by the Ukrainian drone. In this situation, it's such that the 2 soldiers here don't panic, but instead continue driving straight ahead. They keep on going, but as you will see, it doesn't help much, as the Ukrainian drone, despite their swerving left and right and their relatively high speed, the drone stays locked on them. It's a myth that's being pushed onto the Russian soldiers, one that's repeatedly drilled into their minds. If you all learn this well, then you'll have the chance to escape. That's not the case. The drones are also hitting moving motorcycles. Here we see once again some vehicles that manage to arrive safely, and on the left side, we once again spot what appears to be a Lada Niva. That made it, that got through. However, only a few soldiers are the ones who survived. We're seeing here he's about to throw his AK at the drone. That won't help either, and now these Russian soldiers are being taken out one by one by the Ukrainian drones. And this whole situation shows exactly why Ukraine isn't in such a hurry right now to say, yes, we'll accept any peace deal, we'll give away our land, because we see these are the Russian attacks. These are the vast majority of Russian attacks that we've witnessed in recent weeks and months. Every so often in between, a single strike with 20 tanks and armored vehicles. Later on, we'll also take a closer look at how the Russian army still currently has armored vehicles. Nonetheless, as we'll briefly take a look at on the map now, the vast majority of Russian attacks are still carried out using such civilian vehicles, with such junk vehicles, because the Russian generals think to themselves, well, our vehicles aren't coming back anyway, so why bother? First of all, we don't have enough armored vehicles, and secondly, even if we did, the armored vehicles we've used in the last months and years, like the BTR, the BMP, the T-72 and so on, were mostly just one-way transports. That means you drove in a certain direction, and at the latest, after dropping off, the vehicle was then destroyed. So you think to yourself, let's just take the inexpensive vehicles, the people are worthless anyway, they can be sacrificed, and in that sense, it's only consistent. We saw an attack near Uspenivka, a village close to Pokrovsk, long contested and partly under Russian control. But we are seeing it at what cost? A large portion of the Russian troops deployed, estimated on some days to be between 70 to 90%, is being killed during the advance. The others may eventually secure their positions, and if they still outnumber the Ukrainian defenders, they advance extremely slowly and at an extraordinarily high cost. And we're watching a video from the Russian army which clearly demonstrates that what we're seeing is no coincidence at all. It's not like you're saying, oh, well, a motorcycle was used there, but that's just because they're in a local pinch. No, the Russian army explicitly states that this is part of their deliberate training exercises. We're currently instructing our soldiers in Russia on the training grounds how to advance effectively using motorcycles. We can see there are many explosions happening here on the left and right. This means the motorcyclists are supposed to learn exactly what we've just seen to navigate through mined areas. They're not live, the mines, but they're still supposed to ride directly through that exact spot. We constantly face these explosions. They're expected to scale this terrain with their motorcycle, and we're seeing these are official footage from the Russian army. They're not ashamed of it anymore, nor are they hiding it, that a large part of the attacks are currently being carried out with motorcycles. And this, of course, has very little to do with a modern army or the military force that was once widely regarded as the second strongest in the world back in 2022. We remember more than 150,000 soldiers advanced into Ukraine exclusively with military vehicles. Now we are 3.5 years later, and we can see this is the current state of the Russian army. And that this is by no means an isolated case. We want to take a look at another attack just a few kilometers away from Uspenivka, and this one is from Konstantinopol. And in this case, we quite interestingly have a split cam of the Ukrainians. That means we have exactly the same image, once in the normal view and once in the thermal view on the left side. We can see why the Ukrainians use thermal view even during the day. It offers much better contrast and makes spotting attackers far easier. Here we can see it relatively well. On the right side, yes. With a bit of imagination, you can make out 3 motorcycles here. On the left side, you can clearly see these 3 black dots. That's the thermal imaging, which shows us what is warmer. And you can also see all the other motorcycles behind it just passing through here. Here, you see just small dots. That's exactly why the Ukrainians also have or why they are willing to show third parties or others what they can achieve with their drones and with their defense. We can now see quite clearly why thermal imaging is used on the left side all the time during the day, and on the right side, it's the regular view. So we're observing these motorcycles, at least 8 of them we just spotted, arriving here, making an attempt to attack this very position right now. However, they haven't quite reached where the Ukrainians are positioned. And we can see that because immediately afterward, the Ukrainians strike with 155mm cluster artillery munitions. We'll see it now, again typical as these are. The circular impacts we're observing here. Noticeable here, but also just visible at the beginning here, that's the same impact we're seeing parallelly in this section. All of this leads once again to massive losses for the Russians, who attack here every single day with large numbers of vehicles, sometimes dozens of soldiers, and at times even hundreds of soldiers per day. Near Konstantinopol, just a bit south of Andriivka, we'll take a closer look in a moment. And yet they barely make any progress. They don't advance, but still needed roughly 2 weeks, maybe a month per village for 2-3 kilometers. Why is that? Here we see 90% of Russians die trying, the other 10% make it eventually. What we're seeing here is quite interesting. This is a new type of cage being constructed, again on civilian vehicles. We'll see that in a moment. It's exclusively civilian vehicles being used, primarily of the Lada and Moskvich types, along with other Russian tractors or manufacturers commonly found throughout the region. Once more, we observe, pixelated, that the dismounted infantry was taken out by Ukrainians. It's not as if they're saying, we destroyed the vehicles, so now we'll simply let the Russians move on. Those who managed to get from A to B are subsequently attacked one by one and for the most part killed by the Ukrainians. Nonetheless, here we see again what we just observed. So these are 3 vehicles with some sort of, well, what is that greenhouse-like structure on top with some kind of grid. That's been draped over them. We'll see it again shortly in a close-up. And now we're seeing, however, that the Ukrainians are once again, here we see it, attacking with cluster munitions. The vehicles are being hit directly. Let's rewind it briefly. You can see it's unmistakably the same scene. We have this initial fire here, and we'll see it right away. In the closer-up shot, so in this particular view alone, we can once again see it quite clearly and distinctly here. 1, 2, 3, 4 vehicles, all of them civilian, each and every one completely destroyed. And finally, we see a Russian recording once again, clearly showing us precisely how the vehicle looked beforehand. So this is the precise level of protection that the Russians are currently providing for their own soldiers on the battlefield. And we've just seen that this is absolutely insufficient. And again, the whole thing shows us why Ukraine doesn't say, well, we've already lost the war, we need to surrender, as some in Germany claim. But why we clearly observe now that the advancing Russian forces' attack attempts in 2025 were scaled down to such a level. We also want to take another quick look at this scene on the map and now observe how the front situation has steadily developed in Andriivka over the past few weeks and months. Yes, the Russians successfully took control of Kurakov here on the far right in January and have since managed to advance approximately 7 to 8 kilometers over the course of just 4 months. That's what they've managed to achieve. As I mentioned before, that's 2 kilometers per month at an enormous blood price that's been paid for it. The footage we've just seen comes from around this region. South of Konstantinopol, they attempted to advance further but were ultimately halted by the vehicles we just witnessed, resulting in their failure. However, the Strategy the Russians are using here is the familiar horseshoe tactic we've seen before. This means Constantinople is being extremely heavily defended by the Ukrainians. That's why they're now trying to advance from the south towards Bahatir. And if they manage to capture Bahatir and the village to the north of it, then the Ukrainians' very strong defense in Constantinople would be in vain. We would have to pull back because, as we can clearly see, there are actually two primary supply routes. Both are already under threat. And nonetheless, if the Russians were to capture Bahatir, or if they were to advance further westward from Andreevka, then the Ukrainers would have to abandon Konstantinovka, because you simply can't defend the entire region without proper logistics. So we see the Russian strategy remains unchanged overall. Only the deployed equipment is increasingly less armored and more civilian, which makes the whole thing considerably easier for the Ukrainians in terms of defense. Nonetheless, it's important to remember there are still Russian tanks out there. There are several tanks currently in operation, but we still need to carefully examine and thoroughly evaluate the overall circumstances at hand. How many tanks can Russia actually produce per month? At the moment, it is estimated that they can build or restore around 50 tanks each month, taking into account both new production and refurbishment efforts. That means we're talking about some new T-90Ms, which are the modern tanks, as well as T-72s and T-80s, which are constantly being restored or upgraded to meet current standards and to the level of either the M variant, which is the modern version, or to the 2022 standard, following a significant wave of modernization that was carried out during that particular time frame. And if we calculate the whole thing, that's 50 per month, and we just look at 1 day's worth of video, then you realize these 50 per month, if you were to deploy all of them in Ukraine, after 5 days, they'd all be destroyed. And that's exactly the reason why we continue to see some smaller tank assaults like this one we are looking at here, but simultaneously attacks involving civilian vehicles. Here we are witnessing the destruction of 3 main battle tanks belonging to the Russian army, effectively carried out by 3 Ukrainian drones in action. Of course, the Ukrainians likely deployed more than that. Nonetheless, here we see it, there's the second strike very close by. Here we observe the second, and immediately we'll witness the third one. A tank managed to retreat into the trees, and then there, as we can clearly see here, it's also coming under heavy attack. And that is also a fatal hit, ultimately resulting in the complete destruction of the tank. And we see this is a single video from an attack where the Russians took out 3 tanks, and they were immediately destroyed. If we extrapolate this again, we assume that essentially all tanks of the Russian army are being deployed in Ukraine. And that's not at all clear. It's widely assumed that the Russians are holding back a significant portion in reserve, potentially keeping some ready for a possible invasion of the Baltic states, and that they, of course, are also using them to maintain and secure other borders in various regions across the country. Then we can assume that Russia's tank army will lose all the newly built and refurbished tanks in Ukraine within a very short time every month, and then there's an additional 25-day period before they can rebuild and replenish their forces again, where you simply don't need armored vehicles to continue pushing forward. We're seeing that Russia's recent attempts to advance in Ukraine have completely failed, at least over the past 48 hours, with no significant progress being made. Where the Russians haven't faced failure is in Kursk and Belgorod. We remember it well. In Kursk, it was said, I think 2 months ago, that everything was completely liberated, that the Ukrainians were driven out. It now seems to be the case 2 months later that they have indeed managed to bring even the last village under their control. We're taking a look at 2 brief Russian videos. One of them features the village of Gornal, located directly on the border with Ukraine, where it appears, and the footage seems to confirm this if you take it at face value, where they have supposedly now regained control. This doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have been entirely pushed out of Kursk, but rather that they have been forced to retreat and have lost control over all the populated areas. However, we're seeing it here now. The Russian flag is being raised on the house, or more precisely, on what's left of the heavily damaged structure. That means the Ukrainians still occupy some heights along the border, but no longer control any villages. The same applies to Popovka. Popovka, a very small village, one of 2 that in Belgorod nearby, about 30 kilometers to the south, fell under Ukrainian control. That also happened 2 months ago, and here we now see at least 2 soldiers proudly holding the Russian flag, marching through the village, clearly aiming to demonstrate to us, to the Russian people, or whoever this video was specifically created for, that they have effectively regained full control over this territory. So, the Russians have managed, after General Gerasimov yesterday once again thanked the North Koreans for their heroic efforts, as he put it, for their very professional and effective deployment, as he called it, expressing gratitude, noting that thousands of North Korean soldiers died here to reclaim Kursk. We have apparently succeeded at the very least in bringing all the inhabited areas in Kursk and Belgorod fully under their control. We're looking at the map and see that this whole area borders Sumy. Officially, the Ukrainian army has been saying for a while now that they fear the Russian large-scale offensive in Sumy. However, as we just observed, if the Russians aren't keeping hundreds of armored personnel carriers stationed somewhere here, then these are mainly infantry forces and civilian vehicles that are being deployed in Kursk and Sumy, or rather in Kursk and Belgorod. We just saw here from Gornal, we have the images here. We can see the orange from our map provider Deep State Map has now practically shifted right up close to the area of Gornal itself. And if we look closely, the entire village is now in orange. That indicates it's currently under heavy fighting. And we've seen footage from Popovka, located a bit further south here. Let's take another look at it. So that's only about 20 kilometers. That was one of two villages situated near Demidovka, which had briefly fallen under Ukrainian control in the Belgorod region and has now been fully reclaimed by Russian forces, at least during the time of filming. But before the Ukrainians were there, and as the Russians had declared, now comes the retaliation. We're advancing into Sumy as vengeance for Kursk. We are not seeing that yet. We are still observing that up here in Basivka there is a Russian presence and that further small sections along the border remain under their control, as we can see here, for example, are under Russian control within Ukraine. However, this offensive or the counteroffensive towards Sumy, we are not seeing on the ground. What we're seeing instead are the large-scale attacks on both military and civilian targets in Sumy instead, which in recent weeks have killed dozens. And also in Ukraine, the Russian army continues to remain quite active, of course. We've obtained new footage that clearly demonstrates how a self-propelled Soviet howitzer is being completely destroyed by the Russian forces in Ukraine. And we're now going to take a closer look at the footage. It originates from the Terny area, specifically the region surrounding Terny in the Donetsk region, right at the heart of the front line. And we're seeing here now that the Russians, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, have spotted them. That this self-propelled launcher, after firing, we're hopefully seeing it now, I hope you can spot it, driving into this shelter. That means here a sort of bunker was built underground where the gun carriage has just fired and is now driving back into it. And we see this here from the two Ukrainian soldiers. I think you can see it quite well here, that there's panic and how quickly these branches, these trees are being set up again so that the Russians don't realize that there's a vehicle hidden behind it. But we've seen the issue. The Russians always catch on, they've got the timing down perfectly. Filmed with a drone and precisely recorded where the Ukrainians fired, and as a result, they are now attacking the forest area. And we can already see in the footage that this forest area is likely also under strong suspicion by the Russians that Ukrainian positions are here, because we can already see fires burning all over the place. The forest area had already been targeted by artillery earlier. Now, right around this spot, the drone is moving in and launching an attack on this Akatsiya 152mm self-propelled howitzer. There you can see what just fired. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, here we have a direct hit, either on the self-propelled gun itself or on the ammunition. And we can see that the ammunition is now catching fire here, and we are experiencing several secondary explosions. This clearly demonstrates the Russians remain active. There's no way to hide it. The Russians also continue to kill Ukrainian soldiers every day at the front lines in Ukraine. However, this doesn't coincide with large offensives or significant territorial gains, as we saw, for example, back in January of this year. Let's take a look at another video from the Ukrainian army where this time a Russian tactic was employed. That means when people laugh and say, what are the Russians even up to? It looks straight out of World War II. You have to keep in mind. That is indeed something that is effective, that works, and something that the Ukrainians have also adapted in many cases. We now see here that two Ukrainian soldiers are storming a Russian position which had been, so to speak, heavily shelled before they launched their assault. We can see quite clearly here. All this white suggests massive fires have raged intensely. The trees around the edges are still green, which implies the Ukrainians focused less on those areas, but they heavily fired into the center. And now we're seeing two Ukrainian soldiers who are proceeding very tactically, almost flawlessly. One stays up front, covering the other, keeping his aim fixed on the bunker the entire time because the Russians are suspected to be inside. And the other soldier maneuvers around the outside and is now preparing to throw an TM-62 anti-tank mine straight into that bunker. We've been witnessing this repeatedly from Russian forces in recent days. However, the Russians apparently timed the fuses so poorly that the explosion occurred almost immediately after they threw them in, which of course is extremely dangerous for the respective soldiers as well. We're seeing the scene again. One covers below, ensuring no one exits the bunker. And the other, we can see it quite clearly here, tosses this anti-tank mine in. You never know when it detonates, so they're now running. They're quickly rushing away, though not out of control. One is running, the other keeps aiming. We can see it relatively well here. He continues to aim with his rifle. Now again, he continues to aim at what just happened there. And now we see the explosion inside this bunker. That means this tactic, once you've managed to get the opponent to stop peeking out of the bunker, when he's trapped and hiding in his trench, in his position, pinned down by prior shelling, possibly already wounded, then it's logical for both sides militarily to drop a mine there, as it's cheaper and at least partly more precise in execution rather than relying on another drone. We're observing a tactic the Russians have frequently employed in recent months, which the Ukrainians are now also adopting, to make absolutely sure that the enemy in their hiding spot or defensive position actually sustains significant damage right there. First, let's take a look at a video that's caused quite a stir these past few days. Allegedly, Ukrainian intelligence forces are responsible for the assassination of yet another Russian general, and not just anywhere in Ukraine, but very close to his own residence in the Moscow region, just outside the Russian capital. We have multiple videos that also recorded the moment of the killing in detail. It's not entirely clear why someone was still filming there. Presumably, it's someone who knew that an explosion was about to happen. This general is Yaroslav Moskalik, a highly prominent and senior-ranking officer within the Russian military intelligence agency, the GRU, who played a central and active role in the invasion of Ukraine. And we're going to let this play out now, and in just a moment you'll witness his vehicle being completely destroyed by an explosion. Here we see the moment the man was instantly killed, and here we have additional footage of the scene. This is the vehicle that exploded. Whether he was already inside or just about to get in, that's not entirely clear. There are also images of his body near the vehicle, which we will not show here. It's not clear whether he had already been moved out or whether he was thrown away by the explosions. We can see that the entire incident presumably occurred in the vicinity of his residence. That's where this GRU general resided, and the Ukrainians were extremely proud of it, stating, "Yes, he was our primary target. We carried out the attack due to his deep involvement in Ukraine and his significant role in Russia's invasion of the country." And this whole thing shows us that Ukrainian services, either the GRU, which is the military intelligence in Russia, or the SSU, the domestic intelligence service, that these services either have their own cells who are operating around Moscow, or that they have managed to recruit Russian agents who are themselves dissatisfied, for example, with Putin's regime, and therefore presumably acting in the name of Ukraine, or any other, unknown to us, motive. To eliminate military personnel of the Russian Federation within Russia,